My friend and I do building renovations, and we found a broken head. Part 1. Our foreman stomped across the cracked concrete floor, his face a collage of impatience and dust, when we clambered up to him from the basement's dim depths. I recognized the furrowed brow and crossed arms from a dozen job sites before this one. Lyle wasn't used to being kept waiting. Mark climbed ahead of me and tossed the balled-up poem at him like it was a baseball. Lyle didn't even flinch as it bounced off his chest. I half expected him to pitch it back and tell us to go screw around on our own time, but instead, he just squinted at us, shaking his head. "Looks like you've seen a ghost," he said, gruff and skeptical. Jake leaned against the exposed brick wall, breathing heavy from the climb. "You're not far off, boss." He rubbed his hands over his shaved head and let out a laugh that was mostly for show. "You ain't gonna believe this." I caught my breath, slinging an arm around Jake's shoulder, ready to back him up. But it was Mark who spoke next, voice calm, measured and subtly more serious than normal for him. "We found something down there." Lyle snorted. "Don't tell me you're digging for treasure. I pay you clowns to renovate, not play pirates." He picked up the paper from where it had landed at his feet and unfurled it, brow furrowing even deeper as he read. "What's this supposed to be, a joke?" "It's real," I said, more serious now. "We hit a spot where the floor gave out. Next thing we know, we're in some kind of stone cellar." "Could have been killed," Jake added, shaking his head with mock gravity. "Thought we were gonna be headlines. Workers crushed in tragic basement accident." Lyle shot him a look that said he wasn't in the mood for jokes. "You're telling me the floor just collapsed?" "I walked that whole area myself this morning." "It collapsed, all right," I said, raising my hands in surrender. "Not trying to accuse you of shoddy inspections, Lyle, but it dropped us like a bad habit." Jake nodded. "We've never seen anything like it, that room down there. It's not on any of the blueprints." Lyle rubbed his beard, considering this. His face softened just a notch. "And this?" he asked, holding up the poem. Mark's voice dropped like he was about to tell a campfire story. "We weren't alone down there. Found someone waiting for us." "A doll," Jake clarified, his expression grim. Lyle's eyebrows shot up in a mixture of disbelief and amusement. "You're screwing with me. Tell me you're screwing with me." "Wish we were," I said. "The thing's got a busted head and eyes that look right through you. You'd have to see it to believe it." I glanced at Jake, wondering if maybe he had bought the prop as a prank. But his face was all business, as usual. Lyle tossed the poem back, shaking his head. "You don't have better things to do than come up with this shit." He looked at each of us in turn, searching for a crack in our story. "Give us some credit," Jake said. "We know our limit. We only lie when it comes to most sick days and reasons we can't come into work." Mark leaned in, making it clear he wasn't joking at all. "This is serious, Lyle. There's something wrong in this place. You know as well as we do, floors don't just drop out for no reason." Lyle stood there, frowning like he was calculating some impossible equation. Finally, he grunted and gestured toward the basement. "All right, show me. But if this is some kind of stunt, you're all out on your asses, you hear?" I tucked the poem back in my pocket. Wouldn't expect any less. We grabbed the tools and gear we'd left scattered across the floor earlier. Jake rolled his eyes like he was being forced into child labor. "Didn't sign up for extra credit," he said. "Put in the work now, and you can sleep in tomorrow," I shot back. He shrugged. "Not a morning person. Figure I'll just sleep in anyhow." "You call what you do work," Lyle said, still gruff but a bit more relaxed. The exchange of banter eased some of the tension as we got moving again. "So how old you think this place really is?" I asked, partly to mess with Lyle but also curious. "Got your curiosity going, huh?" Lyle shot back. "Older than me at any rate." "Older than dirt," Jake chimed in, making me laugh. We reached the basement, and Lyle looked around, frowning at the chaotic sprawl of tools and debris we'd left behind. "Everything looks in order to me," he said. "Take another look," I replied, pointing to the jagged hole gaping in the floor. Lyle squinted at it. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. Jake slapped him on the back, unable to resist one last dig. "Stick with us, Lyle. Lots more surprises where that came from." Lyle hovered like an expectant father while we set up the ladder, his brows pulled together in a skeptical knot. "Sure you're up for this?" I said, smirking as I wrenched the last piece of equipment into place. He grunted, dismissive. "Just hope it's not the bottom of my boot I find when I get down there." Jake slapped me on the back, already more upbeat than he should be after our last trip down. Better let the boss go first, he joked. Get all the ghosts shaking in their boots. Old or new, Lyle said, it's still a pile of bricks and rotting wood. Don't start wetting your pants on me. Mark steadied the ladder, but his face looked pained, like he had a headache or something. You all right, Mark? What? Oh yeah, I'm fine. Just got a bit of a headache. These fumes are not doing great for it either. He tried to smile and brush it off, but it seemed to be really bothering him. We started down, the air damp and heavy with that neglected building smell. Every footstep echoed in my chest, and I felt the rawness of the concrete through my boots, as if the whole place was trying to crawl into my skin. Lyle's threats were light years away in my mind as we dropped back into the blackness. It's even creepier than last time, I said, taking the last step off the ladder. Everything's creepier when you know what's coming, Jake said, but he didn't sound too convinced himself. The climb seemed endless, our breath shallow and quick as we made our way down. The light from the open floor above barely reached us, casting long shadows that moved with us like impatient companions. When Lyle finally touched ground, he scanned the subbasement, his expression hard to read. Not seeing much here. He said it was right over here, I replied, pointing to the spot where we'd left the doll. I half expected it to be sitting there, still as death and twice as ugly. Instead, nothing but an empty patch of concrete. Even the dust looked disturbed, like the thing had dragged itself off into a corner. Lyle squinted into the gloom, his disbelief palpable. Seems to me you're making a lot of noise over a whole lot of nothing. The air felt thicker, somehow, like we were breathing the weight of Lyle's skepticism. I watched him try to make sense of the space, his hands on his hips, eyes scanning the walls for some clue or proof, or maybe even the joke he was so sure we were playing. We're not wasting your time, Lyle, I said. It was here. We all saw it. Jake's looked uncharacteristically concerned and muttered, it's like it got up and walked away. Lyle crossed his arms, the hard line of his mouth carving deeper into his face. It don't make sense, Mark said. We wouldn't have dragged you down here just to mess with you. Wouldn't you? Lyle shot back, his voice loud enough to echo. I felt the same unease creeping over me that I did the first time we found the damn thing. The room seemed bigger without the doll, the emptiness stretching out in every direction. You don't pay us to come up with stories, I said. It was real. Was, Lyle said. What? Looks like it still is, just in your heads. He turned his back and walked a few paces, letting the accusation hang there like old cobwebs. Could be something supernatural, I ventured. Creepier things have happened in creepy places. Lyle's jaw worked side to side, like he was trying to chew through this latest load of bull. Do I look like an idiot to you? You brought me down here for a show and forgot the main attraction. Jake shuffled around like he was trying to find a new angle, looking behind beams and around columns. Was here. Damn thing was here. He bent to peer into a space between some rusting ductwork. I watched him reach in, like he expected the doll to pop out at him. Aha, he said, voice full of triumph before turning to disappointment. Nothing. The emptiness of the room pressed down on us, the bare concrete more menacing than any doll could have been. I watched Lyle, saw his patience drain as we searched and came up empty again and again. We're not lying, I said. Something going on here, even if we don't understand it. Lyle marched back to the ladder, frustration lining every step. I've had enough of this wild goose chase, he said, climbing faster than I'd ever seen him move. I want you all back to real work by noon. We stood there, three fools in a hole, as his voice trailed up the concrete walls and faded into silence. As Lyle went back up the ladder, we all lingered in the sub-basement looking around, as if expecting the things we saw to show up as soon as he had left. Suddenly, Mark clutched his head with both hands and groaned in pain. Man, my brain's gonna explode, he said, sinking to his knees. The bravado was gone from his voice, leaving something raw and pained in its place. What's wrong? I asked, rushing over to him. Jake joined me, crouching low. Is it the dust? He said, as though Mark were having an allergic reaction and not about to keel over. It's something in my head, Mark said, wincing as he fought to get the words out. Messing with me. Break, it wants to break, it says I am it? Lyle was on the ladder, almost back to the top. He must have heard Mark because he called back down to us. What's he on about now? He said, his voice sharper than it needed to be. Mark's face was a mask of sweat and pain, and the vein in his forehead stood out like it was about to burst. Feels like it's cracking open, he said. His voice broke, and I could hear real fear in it now. "We need to get him out of here," I said, looking from Jake to Lyle and back again. Lyle came back down and was next to us, breathing heavily from the short run across the room. "Let's go," he said, urgency creeping in. They grabbed Mark under the arms, trying to lift him, but he slipped through their hands and hit the floor hard. His whole body tensed, and he shook like he was being electrocuted. "Seizure," I yelled. "He's having a seizure." "Hold him steady," Jake said. "Don't let him hurt himself." He was all business even now, but I could hear the tremor in his voice. Mark convulsed in their grip, his muscles rigid as steel. I dropped down and cradled his head in my hands, feeling the slickness of his sweat, the awful heat radiating off him. Lyle tried to help, his gruffness replaced by frantic energy. "Don't just sit there," he barked, more out of desperation than anger. "We need to move him." I felt my stomach twist as I watched Mark thrash and jerk. It was like he was being puppeteered by something inside him, something we couldn't see. Then, as quickly as it started, it stopped. Mark went limp, his head lolling to the side, eyes half open and vacant. Jake looked at me, a question in his eyes. I had no answers for him, only the hollow pit of dread that had settled in my gut. "Is he?" I couldn't finish the sentence. "We need to try," Jake said. "Get him to a hospital. Now." Lyle pulled at Mark's arms again. This time, there was no resistance. The absence of struggle was worse than the convulsions. We hauled him to the ladder, his feet dragging on the ground, his head bobbing as though detached. Every second was an eternity, the silence louder than any of Mark's screams had been. And then he twitched. Once. Twice. "He's coming to," I said. Relief and fear tangled in my throat. Mark's body jerked upright, rigid again but different this time. His face contorted, then stilled. His mouth stretched wide, soundless and empty. Something split. A crack ran through the side of his head, opening like a wound, and a sickly light poured out. We stumbled back, the three of us, falling over ourselves to get away. "Jesus," Lyle said, his voice strangled. Mark stayed there, perched like a broken marionette, that awful light leaking from him in unnatural bursts. "What the actual hell?" Jake screamed. We stood frozen, helpless and horrified as Mark's body spasmed again. He looked dead, and yet he moved in ways that no living thing should move. Then he was still, and for a heartbeat I thought it was over, until he turned toward us. His limbs jerked into action, mechanical and precise. His head flopped to one side, the light still spilling out like the eye of a monster. The splitting, tearing sound was awful as he twitched spasmodically, and the worst part was the breaking and shifting of his skull, and pieces came apart and rearranged themselves. He took a step, then another. "Mark," I said, a pitiful plea. I barely recognized my own voice. He didn't answer, didn't even look like he heard me. Lyle and Jake stood dumbfounded, rooted to the spot. I grabbed Jake's arm, pulling him back. "We gotta go," I said. Mark kept coming, relentless, each step more sure than the last. Lyle snapped out of it, grabbing a piece of metal pipe, holding it like a weapon. "It won't stop," Jake said, backing away. I watched as Mark reached us, saw Lyle swing the pipe. It connected with a sickening crack that split Mark's head open even further. He did not fall down. His bones contorted and reshuffled after the impact, even with the force sounding loud enough to have shattered his spine. The thing that was once Mark forced its destroyed face to look at us again, and it gurgled an almost imperceptible word through its ruined face. "Run!" We heeded the advice and ran, the shock wearing off enough to get us moving. "It's still him," I said. "It's still him, and it's not." Mark followed, that terrible light blazing out of his shattered and broken head. We reached the ladder, and I almost thought we'd make it. But a wall of debris had formed in front of us, blocking the exit, an impossible mass of twisted metal, plastic, and what appeared to be doll heads. And worse, what looked like fragments of real skulls, cracked and hollow like the doll heads we'd found. We were trapped with a thing that wore Mark's skin. "Keep moving," Lyle yelled, his voice cracking. But it was useless, and we knew it. Mark's voice rattled the air with a brittle edge, sharp and jagged like the wind through broken glass. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, shrill and echoing in the tight confines of the subbasement. The words were unintelligible, but held a terrible urgency. The more we tried to listen, the more it filled our heads, pressing in until we thought our own skulls might split. Jake pulled me toward the darkened corridors at the far side of the room. We sprinted into the unknown, stumbling and gasping, the sound of Mark's pursuit always close behind. His footsteps were deliberate and steady, gaining on us with a patience that only increased our panic. "This way," Lyle yelled, as much a command as it was a plea. He led us through the maze of old pipes and low-hanging beams, his long strides keeping pace just ahead of Jake and me. The path wound back toward the stairs, an open expanse that would leave us exposed. We hesitated, and that split second cost us. Mark rounded the corner, sudden and implacable. The sickly light from his head cut through the dimness, throwing a grotesque shadow of himself across the walls. Lyle shoved Jake and me toward a side room. "Go," he said, the words ripped from his throat with desperate urgency. We staggered through the narrow doorframe, spinning to see Mark bear down on him. "Lyle, watch out," Jake cried, his voice raw and filled with the helplessness I felt gnawing at me. But Lyle didn't flinch. He raised the metal pipe in one last defiant swing. Mark took the hit with a grotesque jerk of his shoulders, but it didn't stop him. He reached Lyle in 3 long strides, arms moving with that same puppet-like speed, grasping, pulling. And then Lyle screamed, a sound so full of agony and defiance that it froze me in place. Mark had him by the neck, forcing him to his knees. The crack came next, sharp and dreadful, the same sound that had come from Mark only minutes before. I watched in horror as Lyle's head split open, the light exploding outward like a grotesque birth. It radiated through the space, blinding us with its unnatural brilliance. That creature that had once been Mark gurgled something out loud that sounded like, "You are it." The scream ended abruptly. Lyle went limp, collapsing to the ground, the glow from his head casting an eerie halo around his body. "Run," Jake said, the single word a shattered whisper in the oppressive silence.